Spring Branch, Texas, October, 1878. The air held the dry, brittle scent of a long summer finally breaking. Along the Guadalupe River, the cypress knees stood stark against the low water, and the hill country cedars were dark green islands in a sea of browning grass. On a small plot of land cleared from the stubborn limestone and juniper, Vojtěch Hanzlík was building his house. And the whole settlement thought he was a fool. He wasn't raising a log cabin or a stone cottage. He was laying courses of empty bottles, their round bottoms facing outward like 1,000 glassy eyes. He packed them in a thick, sticky mortar of lime, clay, and sand, each bottle carefully sealed with its cork, each one laid with the same precision he once used to handle a blowpipe. Asa Linthicum, the closest thing the scattered community had to a physician, reined in his horse, watching the Bohemian work. Linthicum was a man of science, a man who trusted what he could see and measure, and what he saw made no sense. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the caliche soil. "Hanzlík," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man accustomed to giving diagnoses. "I've held my tongue, but this has gone far enough. What in God's name do you think you're building?" Vojtěch Hanzlík straightened his back. He was not a large man, but his shoulders were broad from years of furnace work. He wiped a smear of clay from his cheek with the back of his hand. "A wall, doctor," he said, his English still thick with the rhythms of his homeland. "That's not a wall," Linthicum countered, gesturing with his riding crop. "That's a menace. You have a wife in there. Children? The first real blue norther we get, the first hard freeze, and every one of those bottles is going to shatter from the cold. The thermal shock will turn this place into a coffin of knives, raining shards of glass down on your family while they sleep." He wasn't being cruel. It was a professional assessment of risk, delivered with clinical certainty. A neighbor, a rancher named Silas Croft, nodded in grim agreement. "The doctor's right, Hanzlík. It's foolishness, plain foolishness." Vojtěch looked at the wall, at the way the afternoon sun caught the varied colors of the glass, browns from beer, greens from wine, the occasional startling blue of a patent medicine bottle. He picked up another bottle, checked its seal, and laid it gently into the mortar. "The glass will hold," he said, not to them, but to the wall itself. He turned back to his work. The discussion for him concluded. Linthicum shook his head, a mixture of pity and professional frustration on his face, and rode away. The mockery was just beginning. The validation was a Texas winter away. What did this bohemian glassblower, this quiet immigrant working with refuse and mud, understand about the physics of trapped air that a trained physician and a community of seasoned frontier builders had missed? The answer to that question would change how this corner of the Texas Hill Country survived the cold. It's a story of forgotten knowledge and the quiet genius of a craftsman applying his trade to a problem no one else could solve. If you appreciate tales of ingenuity and resilience, consider subscribing to this channel. I promise, by the end of this story, you'll understand not just how this strange wall worked, but why it was a masterpiece of thermal science. What's the strangest building material you've ever seen used? Let me know in the comments below. Vojtěch Hanzlík was not a carpenter. He knew nothing of mortise and tenon joints, of dovetails or king posts. He was not a stonemason, unable to read the grain of a limestone slab or dress it square. He was a sklarz, a glassblower from the forested hills of Bohemia, a region that had been shaping glass into art and utility for 500 years. His life had been dictated not by the angle of the sun, but by the temperature of the furnace. His hands were not calloused from the axe, but scarred with the fine silvery lines of old burns from molten silica. His world had been one of crucibles, glory holes, and annealing ovens. The annealing oven was the key. After a piece was shaped, it had to cool slowly, over hours, or sometimes days, to relieve the internal stresses that would otherwise shatter it with a mere touch. To keep his oven hot overnight without consuming cords of precious hardwood, Vojtěch and his fellow craftsmen would pack the exterior lagging with whatever insulators they could find. The best they had discovered was a thick layer of sealed, empty bottles. The bottles, full of trapped air, held the furnace's heat with astonishing efficiency, a buffer of stillness against the cool night. He didn't have the language of R values or thermal conductivity, but he had something more fundamental, a decade of empirical knowledge. He knew from the way the oven was still warm in the morning that a sealed pocket of air was a powerful barrier to the movement of heat. He and his wife Anna had arrived in Texas 2 years earlier, drawn by pamphlets promising cheap, fertile land. With them were their 2 small children, Jan and Marie. They came seeking space and a new life, away from the rigid hierarchies of the old world. What they found was a beautiful and brutal landscape. The summers were a furnace, but it was their first winter that had nearly broken them. They had built a crude cabin of green juniper logs, chinked with mud and grass, just as their neighbors had advised. It was a sieve for the wind. That first blue norther had been a lesson in physics they felt in their bones. The memory was sharp and painful. Vojtěch remembered the wash water in the basin setting to a sheet of ice between Anna's rinsings of their meager laundry. He remembered little Marie crying out as a tin spoon, chilled to impossibly low temperatures, stuck to her lip as she tried to eat her porridge. Most chillingly, he remembered the silence, the gentle, rhythmic ticking of their old pendulum clock, a treasured heirloom from Bohemia, would slow as the night deepened and the cabin's temperature plummeted. The brass contracted, the oil in the mechanism thickened, and by 4 in the morning, the ticking would fade into an unnerving stillness. The cold had literally stopped time in their house. That winter, they had burned through their woodpile by January and spent the rest of the season huddled together, sick with chest colds, listening to the wind knife through the walls. He had sworn to Anna that they would never face another winter like that. The conventional failure of frontier construction was a matter of simple, brutal physics. The standard Texas cabin, whether built of log or stone, was a creature of mass. Its builders believed that thickness equaled warmth. A thick log wall, a heavy stone fireplace, these things felt substantial, permanent, but they were deeply flawed thermal conductors. A solid log, for all its bulk, offers a direct, uninterrupted path for heat to travel. Heat energy, always seeking equilibrium, would flow from the warm interior, molecule by molecule, right through the solid wood to the frigid outside. The settlers called it the cold soaking in, but the reality was the opposite. The warmth was hemorrhaging out. The stone fireplaces were even worse. Limestone, the abundant local material, is a dense and effective conductor. The massive hearth would absorb huge amounts of heat from the fire, but it would also conduct that heat straight up the chimney and through the back wall into the winter air. An hour after the fire died down, the stone would be radiating a tomb-like chill back into the room. Families like the Crofts, neighbors to the Hanzlíks, were locked in a constant losing battle. They stuffed rags in the cracks, piled dirt against the foundation, and fed their fireplaces with a desperate hunger. Their cabin was a testament to received wisdom, built exactly as Silas Croft's father had built his. And it was failing. On the coldest nights, ice would form on the heads of the nails inside their walls, the metal acting as a superconductive thermal bridge, pulling the freeze right through the wood. The air was never still. It was a river of cold, flowing from the walls and single-pane windows to the floor, creating drafts that no amount of blanket stuffing could stop. The problem wasn't the fire. The problem was the container. They were trying to heat the entire Texas Hill Country, one armload of wood at a time. The settlers were fighting a war of attrition against the cold, and the cold had infinite reserves. Vojtěch Hanzlík, watching his neighbors struggle, knew he couldn't win that war. So he planned to refuse the battle altogether. The construction of the bottle wall was a spectacle. Vojtěch had spent the summer collecting his building materials. He made trips to the saloons in San Antonio and the more respectable hotels, paying a penny for every dozen empty bottles they would give him. He became a familiar, slightly eccentric figure, his wagon rattling with the sound of glass. He gathered hundreds, then thousands, of bottles of every shape and color. Back at his homestead, he and Anna would wash them and carefully reinsert the corks, sometimes sealing them with a dab of pine pitch to ensure they were airtight. He began the build in early fall. First, a sturdy foundation of local stone, rising about a foot off the ground. Then, he mixed his mortar. It wasn't the hard, brittle cement of the modern era, but a soft, forgiving mixture of clay dug from the riverbank, sand, and lime that he'd slaked himself. It had a long curing time and would remain slightly flexible, an essential quality for a wall made of two such different materials as glass and earth. He laid the first course with painstaking care. A thick bed of the lime clay mortar, 18 inches wide, followed by a row of bottles laid on their sides, necks pointing inward. Then another layer of mortar, filling every gap, encasing the bottles completely except for their thick, round bottoms. The outer wall began to look like a honeycomb of dark glass. The inner wall was a mosaic of bottlenecks and corks, which he would later plaster over. The work was slow and methodical. Each day the walls rose by a few inches, and each day the audience of skeptics grew. Asa Linthicum would often stop on his rounds, observing with a practiced, critical eye. Hanzlík, the expansion and contraction rates are completely different, he'd explain as if to a child. The mortar will shrink as it cures, but the glass will not. It will create hairline fractures. Every crack is a victory for the cold. Vojtěch would simply nod, running his trowel over a fresh seam. Is soft mortar, he'd say. It holds. Silas Croft, whose own hands were raw from splitting oak for his insatiable fireplace, was more direct. It's a damnedest thing I ever saw, he'd mutter to anyone who would listen. He's building a house out of trash. When the north wind hits it, it'll sound like 1,000 breaking windows. The children of the settlement would sometimes sneak up to the wall, daring each other to touch the strange, glassy surface. Anna, working in her garden nearby, would watch them with a calm smile. She endured the whispers and the sideways glances from other women at the general store. She had felt the silence of the stopped clock. She had seen the quiet determination in her husband's eyes. Her faith was absolute. He knows the glass, she said once to Mrs. Croft, who had offered her sympathies. He knows its heart. The statement made no sense to the rancher's wife and only deepened the community's conviction that the Hanzlíks were a strange and foolish pair. By the time the first cool winds of November began to blow, the walls were complete, 18 inches thick, a solid, monolithic structure studded with the bottoms of 5,671 bottles. Vojtěch framed in a proper roof and laid a thick wooden floor. From the outside, it was bizarre. From the inside, it was magical. When the sun was low in the east or west, the house was filled with a diffuse colored light, a soft glow of amber, green, and blue that painted shifting patterns on the interior walls. It was, Marie said, like living inside a rainbow. But its true test was not in the light, but in the dark. To understand the genius of Vojtěch Hanzlík's wall, you have to understand the three ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. The settlers' cabins were failing primarily because of conduction. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. When you touch a hot iron, the heat conducts directly to your hand. In a log cabin, the heat from the interior air touches the inside of the log. That energy excites the molecules of the wood, which bump into their neighbors, passing the energy along in a chain reaction until it reaches the outside of the log and escapes into the cold air. A solid, continuous material is a bridge for conduction. Wojciech's wall was not a bridge. It was a series of roadblocks. The lime clay mortar he used was a relatively poor conductor to begin with, much better than solid stone. But its real magic was in what it surrounded. The primary path of conduction through the mortar was constantly interrupted by the glass bottles. Glass itself is a poor conductor of heat compared to stone or metal. But the true insulating champion was what was inside the bottles: air. Still, trapped air is one of the best insulators on the planet. Heat struggles to move through it. Air molecules are spaced far apart and don't transfer energy to each other very efficiently. This is the principle behind a wool blanket or a down jacket. They work by trapping thousands of tiny pockets of air. Each of the 5,671 bottles in Wojciech's wall was a sealed pocket of trapped air. So, for heat to escape his house, it had to follow an incredibly inefficient path. First, it had to conduct through the interior plaster. Then, it had to conduct through the glass neck of a bottle. Then, it had to slowly transfer into the trapped air inside. Then, it had to pass through the air to the other side of the bottle, conduct through the thick glass bottom, and finally conduct through the last few inches of exterior mortar. The key was the thermal break. The column of trapped air inside each bottle acted as a profound break in the conductive path. The heat simply could not find an easy road. The R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of his 18-inch composite wall, was likely 3 to 4 times higher than that of Silas Croft's 8-inch solid log walls. As for Dr. Linthicum's fear of shattering glass, it was based on a misunderstanding of thermal shock. A thin pane of glass shatters when one part of it is heated or cooled much faster than another, creating immense internal stress. But the bottles in Wojciech's wall were completely encased in a thick, insulating layer of mortar. They could never experience a rapid, localized temperature change. The entire wall, inside and out, would warm and cool slowly and evenly as a single unit. The glass wasn't exposed. It was protected, nested deep within the thermal mass of the clay. The Bohemian glassblower understood the nature of his material far better than the Texas physician. He had built not a coffin of knives, but a fortress of stillness. That year, the winter held off until the second week of December. Then, the sky to the north turned a bruised, slate gray. A strange, unnatural calm fell over the hill country. The birds went silent. The air grew heavy. Experienced Texans knew the signs. A blue norther was coming. The front hit just after dusk. The temperature, which had been a mild 62 degrees Fahrenheit, began to plummet. A low moaning sound grew into a savage, roaring wind from the north. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in the first 2 hours. By midnight, it was 10 degrees and falling. By morning, Spring Branch was locked in a crystalline, brutal cold of -4 degrees, a temperature the wind made feel like 20 below. Inside the Croft cabin, it was a state of siege. Silas and his eldest son fed the fireplace constantly, a roaring blaze that seemed to do nothing but send a torrent of heated air straight up the chimney. Mrs. Croft and the younger children huddled by the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air. The side of them facing the fire was hot. The side facing the room was freezing. The walls radiated a deep, penetrating cold. A bucket of water 4 feet from the fire had a thick crust of ice on it. It was a miserable, exhausting existence, a battle for mere survival. Inside the Hanzlík house, a different reality prevailed. Wojciech had built a small, efficient masonry stove instead of a large fireplace. A modest fire of well-seasoned oak burned within it, its metal top radiating a steady, even heat. But the true miracle was the silence. The northern wind, which shrieked and howled outside, was reduced to a distant whisper. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. Anna was at the kitchen table, kneading dough for bread. The wooden surface was cool, but not cold. Her hands, dusted with flour, moved with practiced ease. This simple act of domesticity was a profound victory. In the Croft cabin, any surface away from the fire would have been too cold to touch, the dough stiffening into a stubborn lump. Here the yeast was alive and active. Jan and Marie were on the floor, on a small rag rug, playing with carved wooden toys. They wore simple wool sweaters, but not their heavy coats. The light was dim, but the bottle ends on the south-facing wall, catching the low horizontal rays of the winter sun, glowed with a soft, jeweled light, projecting faint circles of amber and green onto the floor. It was a scene of impossible peace, an island of warmth and calm in a sea of brutal cold. The house was not fighting the winter. It was simply ignoring it. The heat from the small stove and from the family's own bodies was held gently within the walls, unable to escape. Dr. Asa Linthicum had been out for 2 days, treating a severe case of pneumonia at a ranch 10 miles north of Spring Branch. He was riding home on the 3rd day of the norther, leaning low over his mare's neck, his face wrapped in a wool scarf that was stiff with frozen breath. The wind was a physical force, a wall of moving cold that seemed to suck the very life out of the air. His mare, Bella, a normally stoic and reliable animal, was faltering. She kept trying to turn her back to the wind, her steps becoming sluggish and resistant. Linthicum knew the signs of an animal reaching its limit. He had to find shelter, and soon. The sun, a pale, useless disk in the gray sky, was already sinking toward the horizon. He was still 2 miles from his own home when he saw it. A faint, strange glow through the trees. It wasn't the bright, flickering orange of a desperate fire seen through a window. It was a soft, steady, multicolored light. It was the Hanzlík place. He felt a pang of guilt, remembering his harsh words, his confident predictions of disaster. He steered Bella toward the light, his primary concern for his horse. He wouldn't ask for shelter for himself, he decided. He would just use the lee side of the strange house as a windbreak for Bella. Let her recover for a few minutes before pushing on. He dismounted in the relative calm on the south side of the house. The wind's roar dropped to a manageable howl. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the western sky was a slash of frigid orange. Yet the wall before him was still glowing, as if lit from within. Amber, green, and blue circles of light shone with a soft, impossible warmth. Shivering, Linthicum leaned his back against the wall, expecting the biting cold of stone or wood. He braced for the chill to knife through his heavy coat, but it never came. Instead, he felt nothing. No, not nothing. He felt a distinct absence of cold. He pressed his gloved palm flat against the rough clay mortar between 2 bottle ends. It was not warm, not like a hearthstone, but it was not cold either. It was neutral, holding a faint, residual energy. He pulled off his glove, needing to be sure. He placed his bare hand on the wall. He expected the instant, painful sting of contact with a frozen surface. What he felt instead sent a shock through his entire body. The wall was cool, but it held a deep, latent warmth, a thermal inertia that defied the -4-degree air around it. It felt alive. He realized with a start what he was feeling, the stored energy of the afternoon sun, captured within the wall's immense mass, now slowly, gently radiating back out into the twilight. It was a warmth that came from a sun that had already set. He stood there for a full minute, his bare hand pressed against the wall, his scientific mind racing, reevaluating every assumption he had ever made about heat and cold and shelter. The wind howled, his horse shivered, and the wall stood placid and unmoved, leaking its captured daylight into the frozen dusk. He walked to the door and knocked. Vojtěch opened it, and a wave of warm, still air washed over the physician, smelling faintly of baking bread and wood smoke. It was like stepping into another season. Linthicum was speechless for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight and the calm interior. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw Anna sliding a loaf of bread from the stove. He saw a small pot of herbs growing on a windowsill. "Doctor," Vojtěch said, his voice calm, without a hint of triumph. "Come in. It is cold." Linthicum stepped inside, bringing a swirl of frigid air with him that quickly dissipated. He took off his hat, his mind struggling to process the sensory data. On a small shelf near the door, he saw a child's painting set, little tin pans of watercolor paints, red, yellow, blue, sat perfectly liquid. He reached into the saddlebag he'd brought inside. He pulled out his own bottle of black ink, which he used for writing prescriptions and notes. He uncorked it. The ink was frozen solid, a black cylinder of ice attached to the cork. He held the two things in his hands, the liquid paints of the warm house, the frozen ink from the cold world outside. The evidence was absolute, undeniable, and it shattered his certainty more completely than any debater's argument. He looked at Vojtěch Hanzlík, seeing him for the first time not as a foolish immigrant, but as a man who possessed a kind of elemental wisdom. He finally found his voice. "You didn't build a wall, Hanzlík," Asa Linthicum said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "You built a honeycomb of captured daylight." Asa Linthicum became the bottle wall's most fervent and credible advocate. His conversion was total. He spent 2 hours in the Hanzlík house that evening, measuring the temperature in different corners, tapping the walls, asking Vojtěch quiet, respectful questions. He left with a full belly, a warm spirit, and a notebook filled with observations. His medical mind immediately reframed the innovation. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about public health. He had treated dozens of cases of pneumonia, bronchitis, and consumption in the drafty, damp cabins of the region. He saw the constant chill and the need for roaring, air-consuming fires as primary contributors to winter illness. A warm, dry, draft-free house like Hanzlík's, he reasoned, was not a luxury, but a form of preventative medicine. He began prescribing the wall. When a family came to him with a child suffering from a winter chest illness, he would treat the symptoms, but then he would say, "Your medicine will help, but your house is making him sick. Go talk to the Bohemian. Learn how he keeps the winter outside." He recorded his findings in his detailed physician's notebook. He noted the fuel savings. Hanzlík was using less than a quarter of the wood his neighbors burned. He noted the consistent interior temperature, the lack of drafts, the dryness of the air. He titled the entry, "A Proposed Architectural Prophylaxis Against Winter Afflictions of the Lung." In 1880, he sent a cleaned-up version of his notes to a colleague in Houston, who was an editor for a small but respected medical journal. The article was published, detailing the construction method and its observed health benefits. The idea began to spread, carrying the weight of medical authority. By the spring of 1881, a dozen families in the hill country were collecting bottles. The structure was no longer Hanzlík's folly. It was the physician's wall, or the fever-proof house. The very thing that had been an object of ridicule became a symbol of pragmatic, forward-thinking survival. The mockery had lasted a season. The validation would be built into the landscape for a century to come. The simple, elegant physics that Vojtěch Hanzlík deployed in 1878 anticipated principles of building science that would not be fully understood and commercialized for nearly a century. Every modern high-performance window is a direct descendant of his wall. A double or triple-pane insulated glazing unit, IGU, works on the exact same principle. Two or more panes of glass separated by a sealed space filled with air or an inert gas like argon. The gas acts as a thermal break, dramatically reducing the conductive heat loss that plagues single-pane windows. Modern engineers talk about thermal bridging, the problem of heat finding a conductive path through a building's envelope, like through metal studs in a wall or a concrete slab foundation. To combat this, they design thermal breaks, using insulating materials to interrupt these paths. Vojtěch Hanzlík's wall was, in essence, a massive 18-inch thick thermal break. He intuitively understood a concept that architects and engineers would spend the next 70 years rediscovering with slide rules and calorimeters. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was engineering a microclimate. There is a profound lesson in the quiet work of the Bohemian glassblower. The conventional wisdom of his community was to meet the brute force of the cold with the brute force of a bigger fire. Theirs was a philosophy of opposition, of direct combat. It was a loud, smoky, and ultimately inefficient battle that consumed forests and left its combatants exhausted and often sick. Vojtěch Hanzlík's approach was entirely different. It was a philosophy not of opposition, but of intelligent separation. He understood that the greatest power against the cold was not a roaring fire, but a pocket of simple, undisturbed air. He knew that if you could place a barrier of stillness between the inside and the outside, the battle was already won. He didn't build a fortress to fight the cold. He didn't try to overpower the wind. In his quiet, methodical way, he hung thousands of small glass lanterns of trapped air between his family and the wind, and in their gentle collective glow, they found not just warmth, but peace. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found it valuable, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of practical wisdom. We believe the past has lessons that are more relevant than ever today. Let us know in the comments if you've ever seen a house built from unusual recycled materials. We'd love to hear about it. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters' names and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.